The wind carried a peculiar weight as it swept through Eldridge Hollow, a forgotten speck of a town nestled in the fog-choked valleys of upstate New York. Dr. Elias Thorne stepped out of the dust-caked van, his boots crunching against the gravel of the town's only motel, a sagging relic called the Hollow Rest. The air smelled of damp earth and something sharper, like rusted iron left to rot under pine needles. Elias, a man in his late 40s with graying temples and eyes that carried the weariness of too many sleepless nights, adjusted his scarf against the chill. He hadn't chosen Eldridge Hollow for its charm. The town was a means to an end, a stepping stone to the burial mound that had consumed his thoughts for months. His team, 3 graduate students and a local guide, unloaded equipment from the van, their voices muted by the oppressive quiet of the town. The students, Clara, Raj, and Sophie, were young, eager, and blissfully unaware of the undercurrents Elias had already begun to sense. Clara, the sharpest of the trio, was cataloging gear with meticulous care, her auburn hair tied back in a practical bun. Raj, wiry and quick to joke, hauled a crate of trowels and brushes, while Sophie, the quiet one, kept her eyes on the horizon, where the silhouette of the mound loomed against the gray sky. The guide, a grizzled man named Amos, leaned against the van, chewing tobacco and watching the newcomers with a gaze that seemed to see through them. Elias had read about Eldridge Hollow in obscure archaeological journals, tales of a Native American burial mound untouched since the 18th century, sealed by superstition and fear. The locals called it the Whispering Mound, a name that carried a warning no one cared to explain. His research grant was thin, his reputation thinner after years of chasing theories that bordered on obsession, but this dig was different. It felt personal, though he couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the dreams, fragments of his late wife, Marianne, her voice calling from somewhere deep, somewhere buried. He shook the thought away, focusing on the task at hand. The motel clerk, a gaunt woman with hollow cheeks and a name tag reading, Doris, handed Elias a set of keys with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Folks don't stay long in the hollow," she said, her voice low, as if sharing a secret. "Mound's got a way of making you feel watched." Elias nodded politely, but her words lingered, coiling in his mind like smoke. He led the team to their rooms, the floorboards creaking underfoot, the air thick with the scent of mildew and old wood. The walls were papered in faded florals, and the windows rattled in their frames, as if the wind outside was trying to claw its way in. That evening, the team gathered in the motel's cramped dining room, a space lit by a single flickering bulb. Amos joined them, his presence a reluctant necessity. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were heavy with the cadence of someone who knew more than he let on. "You ever hear the wind out here at night?" he asked, his eyes fixed on Elias. "Sounds like voices, don't it? Like they're trying to tell you something." Clara laughed nervously, but Raj leaned forward, intrigued. Sophie remained silent, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. Elias felt a prickle at the base of his neck, as if the room had grown colder. As the team discussed logistics, mapping the mound, setting up a grid for the day, Elias noticed the locals at the bar across the room. They were a weathered bunch, their faces etched with lines that spoke of hard lives and harder winters. They watched the newcomers with a mix of curiosity and suspicion, their conversations falling silent whenever Elias glanced their way. One man, older than the rest, with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, met Elias's gaze and held it. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a warning, unspoken but clear. The night deepened, and the team retired to their rooms. Elias sat on the edge of his bed, the springs groaning under his weight. He opened his notebook, its pages filled with sketches of the mound, historical accounts, and half-formed theories about its origins. The mound was said to be a sacred site, a place where the dead were laid to rest with rituals no living soul remembered. But there were other stories, too, whispers of a curse, of spirits bound to the earth, waiting for something to set them free. Elias dismissed the tales as folklore, but the weight of Doris's words, Amos's cryptic warning, and the scarred man's stare gnawed at him. He stood and crossed to the window, parting the curtains to look out at the town. Eldridge Hollow was a skeleton of a place, its streets empty, its houses hunched against the wind. Beyond the town, The mound rose like a scar on the landscape, its silhouette black against the moonless sky. For a moment, Elias thought he saw movement, a flicker of shadow, too deliberate to be a trick of the light. He blinked, and it was gone. But the unease remained, a quiet pulse in his chest, as if the mound itself was watching him back. Dawn broke over Eldridge Hollow with a sluggish gray light, the kind that seemed to cling to the earth rather than illuminate it. Dr. Elias Thorne stood at the edge of the whispering mound, its bulk rising before him like a slumbering giant, cloaked in mist that curled like fingers over its slopes. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of wet soil and pine, and a faint hum seemed to pulse beneath the ground, too low to be heard clearly but enough to set Elias's teeth on edge. His team gathered around him, their breath visible in the chill morning air, their faces a mix of excitement and unease. Clara adjusted her gloves, her eyes scanning the mound with academic curiosity. Raj cracked a joke about unearthing a cursed treasure, but his laughter died quickly, swallowed by the oppressive silence. Sophie stood apart, her gaze fixed on the mound as if it were speaking to her in a language only she could hear. Amos, the guide, lingered at the periphery, his weathered hands stuffed in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Elias knelt and pressed a hand to the earth, feeling its cold, unyielding surface. This was it, the moment he had been chasing for months, the chance to peel back the layers of history and uncover what lay beneath. He gave the signal, and the team began marking out the grid, their movements methodical but tentative, as if they sensed the weight of what they were about to disturb. The first shovel broke the soil with a dull thud, and Elias felt a shiver run through him, not from the cold but from something deeper, something primal. The earth seemed to resist, clinging to the blade as if reluctant to reveal its secrets. Clara called out measurements, her voice steady but tight, while Raj and Sophie worked in silence, their trowels scraping against roots and stones. As the morning wore on, the team uncovered their first find, a fragment of bone, yellowed and brittle, etched with faint carvings that resembled no known script. Elias held it in his gloved hands, his heart pounding as he traced the lines with his thumb. The carvings were intricate, almost alive, swirling in patterns that seemed to shift under his gaze. Could be ceremonial, Clara suggested, peering over his shoulder, but her tone carried a question mark. Amos, who had been watching from a distance, spat into the dirt and muttered something about leaving sacred things alone. Elias ignored him, cataloging the bone and placing it in a tray, but the air around the mound seemed to thicken, the mist growing denser as if drawn to their work. By midday, the team had unearthed more artifacts, a shard of obsidian, sharp enough to draw blood, a clay amulet shaped like a coiled serpent, and a small bundle of feathers, their tips stained with something dark and sticky. Each find was met with a growing sense of unease, as if the mound were watching, waiting. Then came the sounds, faint at first, like a distant whisper carried on the wind, but growing clearer as the team dug deeper. It was not the wind, Elias realized, but something else, a low murmur that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Words, or the suggestion of words, in a tongue none of them recognized. Sophie froze, her trowel hovering over the soil, her eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Raj nodded, his usual bravado gone, while Clara tried to dismiss it as an echo from the valley. But Elias knew better. The sound was no echo. It was deliberate, insistent, like a plea or a warning. The whispers grew louder as Elias uncovered a larger artifact, a stone tablet, half buried in the soil, its surface covered in the same swirling carvings as the bone. He brushed away the dirt, his fingers trembling, and the whispers seemed to pulse in time with his movements. The tablet was heavy, unnaturally cold, and as he lifted it, the air around him seemed to shimmer, like heat rising from pavement. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move within the mist, a formless shape that flickered at the edge of his vision. He blinked, and it was gone, but the whispers remained, now a chorus of overlapping voices, urgent and unintelligible. The team stood frozen, their tools forgotten, their eyes darting between the tablet and the mound. Amos stepped forward, his face pale. "You shouldn't have touched that," he said, his voice low but firm. "Some things ain't meant to see the light." Elias tried to shake off the unease, focusing on the tablet's carvings. They were hypnotic, drawing his gaze deeper, as if they held answers to questions he hadn't yet asked. But the whispers were relentless, burrowing into his mind, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he heard a familiar voice, Marianne's, soft and distant, calling his name. He dropped the tablet, his breath catching, and the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of his own heartbeat. The team exchanged glances, their faces pale, their hands unsteady. The mound loomed larger now, its shadow stretching across the dig site, as if it had grown in the span of hours. Elias knew they should stop, pack up, and leave, but the pull of the mound was stronger, a compulsion he couldn't explain. He gave the order to continue, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest, and the team obeyed, their shovels breaking the earth once more, each strike echoing like a heartbeat in the silence. In the shadowed corners of Eldridge Hollow, where the streets twisted like veins through the heart of the valley, lived Mrs. Evelyn Harrow. She was a widow of 72, her days spent in a crumbling Victorian house on the edge of town, its paint peeling like old skin and its windows shrouded in dust-laden curtains. Evelyn had outlived her husband by a decade, a man named Harold who had been taken by a sudden illness that no doctor could explain. Since then, she had withdrawn from the world, her only companions the creaks of the house and the distant howl of the wind. But on the day the archaeologist disturbed the whispering mound, something shifted in the air, a subtle rift that Evelyn felt before she heard it, a pressure building in her chest, like the onset of a storm. Evelyn sat in her parlor that afternoon, her arthritic fingers knitting a scarf that would never be finished, the yarn a tangled mess of regrets. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp whose bulb flickered as if struggling to stay alive. Outside, the mist from the mound had spread, seeping into the town like an uninvited guest. She paused her knitting, her head tilting slightly, as if catching a faint sound. At first, it was nothing, just the wind rattling the shutters. But then it came again, a whisper, soft and insidious, weaving through the cracks in the walls. It sounded like Harold's voice, low and murmuring, calling her name from the next room. Evelyn! Evelyn! Her heart skipped, a mix of longing and fear twisting in her gut. She set down the needles and rose unsteadily, her slippers shuffling across the worn rug. The whispers grew clearer as she moved toward the hallway, now accompanied by fragments of words, accusations, memories long buried. You let me go, you didn't fight. Evelyn shook her head, telling herself it was the isolation playing tricks, but the voice persisted, drawing her deeper into the house. She entered the kitchen, where the air felt colder, heavier, and the whispers seemed to emanate from the floorboards themselves. Kneeling with a groan, she pressed her ear to the wood, and the voice surged, now a chorus of murmurs overlapping like echoes in a cave. They spoke of her grief, her unspoken guilt over Harold's death, how she had ignored his early symptoms, too wrapped up in her own petty worries. The words burrowed into her mind, stirring emotions she had long suppressed, making her eyes sting with unshed tears. As evening fell, the whispers evolved, no longer just Harold's voice but others, strangers, their tones laced with ancient sorrow. They urged her to remember, to confess sins she didn't know she carried. Evelyn wandered the house in a daze, her hands trembling as she opened drawers and cabinets, searching for something she couldn't name. In the attic, amid boxes of forgotten relics, she found an old mirror, its surface tarnished and cracked. Staring into it, she saw not her reflection but fleeting images, faces twisted in agony, hands reaching out from the glass. The whispers intensified, wrapping around her like vines, compelling her to act. Dig, uncover, release. She backed away, but the compulsion grew, a burning itch in her veins. By nightfall, Evelyn could no longer resist. The whispers had become a roar in her head, driving her outside into the fog-shrouded yard. The ground was soft from recent rain, and she fell to her knees, her fingers clawing at the earth. Dirt lodged under her nails as she dug, frantic and unthinking, the whispers praising her efforts. Deeper, find us. Hours passed, her nightgown muddied and torn, her breasts ragged. She unearthed nothing but roots and stones, but the act itself seemed to feed the voices, making them louder, more demanding. Visions flashed in her mind, scenes of violence from centuries past, settlers turning on indigenous people, blood soaking the soil. She realized, in a haze of terror, that these were not her memories, but they felt as real as her own, twisting her grief into something darker, more primal. The neighbors heard her cries in the dead of night, muffled sobs that echoed through the mist. One, a young mother across the street, peered through her window and saw Evelyn in the yard, her form illuminated by the pale moonlight, digging with bare hands like a woman possessed. The sight sent chills down the mother's spine, but she dismissed it as the ravings of a lonely old woman. Unbeknownst to her, this was only the beginning. Evelyn collapsed as dawn approached, her body exhausted, but the whispers lingered, promising more if she obeyed. She crawled back inside, leaving a trail of soil, her mind fractured, the line between her sorrow and the mound's curse blurring into one inescapable nightmare. Back at the dig site, Elias felt a distant echo of the disturbance, a fleeting whisper in the wind that carried Evelyn's name, though he didn't know it yet. The mound's secrets were spilling out, seeping into the town, and Mrs. Harrow's lament was the first crack in the dam. The morning after the unsettling whispers at the dig site, Dr. Elias Thorne found himself restless. The memory of the stone tablets' carvings and the faint echo of Marianne's voice gnawing at his thoughts. The mound had stirred something in him, a compulsion to understand its secrets that went beyond academic curiosity. With the team taking a day to catalog artifacts and recalibrate equipment, Elias decided to seek answers in Eldridge Hollow's only repository of history, the town library, a squat, brick building that seemed to sag under the weight of its own neglect. The air inside was thick with the musty scent of old paper and damp wood, and the dim light filtering through grimy windows did little to dispel the gloom. The librarian, a wiry man named Mr. Grayson with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, greeted Elias with a nod, his eyes flickering with the same wariness Elias had come to expect from the townsfolk. Elias requested access to the archives, specifically any records from the town's founding in the late 1700s. Mr. Grayson hesitated, his fingers tapping nervously on the counter before leading Elias to a basement door, its hinges rusted and creaking. "Not many ask for these," he muttered, unlocking the door with a key that looked older than the building itself. The basement was a labyrinth of sagging shelves, piled high with leather-bound journals, crumbling ledgers, and boxes of loose papers yellowed by time. Dust motes danced in the beam of Elias's flashlight as he navigated the narrow aisles, his fingers trailing over spines marked with names like Harrow, Miller, and Thorne, names that sent a chill through him, though he couldn't yet say why. He began with a journal dated 1783, penned by a settler named Ezekiel Harrow, whose spidery handwriting told of hardship and ambition. Ezekiel described the founding of Eldridge Hollow, a settlement built on land wrested from the native tribes through a treaty that was more coercion than agreement. The words were matter-of-fact, but between the lines, Elias sensed a shadow of guilt. Ezekiel wrote of a sacred hill, the tribes revered, a place they warned against disturbing. The settlers ignored the warnings, driven by greed for fertile land, and what followed was a massacre, a brutal clash where blood soaked the earth that would become the Whispering Mound. Elias's pulse quickened as he read, the weight of the tablet's carvings pressing on his mind. The journal hinted at a ritual, a desperate act by the surviving natives to bind the spirits of their fallen to the mound, a curse meant to haunt the settlers' descendants. Another document, a ledger from 1785, detailed the fates of the founding families. The Harrows prospered briefly but were plagued by illness and misfortune. The Millers faced inexplicable accidents, their crops failing despite fertile soil. And the Thornes, Elias paused, his breath catching, his own ancestors, suffered losses that drove them to madness, their name fading from prominence. The ledger mentioned whispers in the night, visions that tormented the settlers, and a growing fear that the mound was alive, watching, waiting. Elias felt a prickle at the back of his neck, as if the basement itself were listening, its shadows deepening with every page he turned. Hours passed, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the building or the distant drip of water. Elias uncovered a final piece, a letter from a woman named Abigail Miller, dated 1790, addressed to her sister. Abigail wrote of nightmares, of voices that spoke in a tongue she didn't understand, urging her to confess sins she hadn't committed. She described a night when she sleepwalked to the mound, her hands stained with earth, as if she had been digging. The letter ended abruptly, the ink smudged, as if written in haste or fear. Elias closed the journal, his mind racing. The artifacts, the whispers, Mrs. Harrow's strange behavior the night before. It was all connected, threads of a curse woven through the town's history, binding the living to the sins of the dead. He emerged from the basement as dusk settled over Eldridge Hollow, the library now empty save for Mr. Grayson, who watched him with a knowing gaze. "Find what you were looking for?" the librarian asked, his voice low. Elias nodded, clutching the photocopied pages he had been permitted to copy. As he stepped into the fog-laden street, the weight of the mound seemed to follow him, its presence palpable even from miles away. The town felt different now, its quiet no longer peaceful but predatory, as if it were waiting for the next crack in the dam to break. Elias knew he was no longer just an archaeologist digging for relics. He was unraveling a truth that might consume them all. As dusk bled into night over Eldridge Hollow, the air grew colder, sharper, as if the valley itself were holding its breath. Dr. Elias Thorne stood alone at the edge of the Whispering Mound, the team's equipment packed away for the day, their tents glowing faintly in the distance. The fog had thickened, a heavy shroud that muffled sound and blurred the edges of the world. Elias had returned to the mound against his better judgment, drawn by an itch he couldn't scratch, a need to stand where the earth had whispered to him the day before. The revelations from the library, Ezekiel Harrow's journal, the curse ritual, his own family's name etched in the town's dark history, had left him restless, his mind a tangle of questions and dread. The mound loomed before him, its silhouette jagged against the starless sky, and for the first time, he felt it watching him, not as a passive observer but as something alive, aware. The wind picked up, carrying a low hum that seemed to rise from the ground itself, a vibration that pulsed through Elias's boots and into his bones. He clutched the photocopied pages from the library, their edges crumpled from hours of handling, and tried to focus on the task ahead, mapping the next phase of the day. But his thoughts kept drifting to Marianne, his late wife, whose voice he had heard, or thought he had heard, when he touched the stone tablet. The memory of her death 2 years ago, sudden and unexplained, was a wound that had never healed. The police had called it an accident, a fall down the stairs, but Elias had always suspected something darker, something he couldn't prove. Now, standing before the mound, he felt her presence, as if she were just beyond his reach. The whispers began softly, like leaves rustling in the distance, but they grew clearer, more insistent. "Elias." The sound was unmistakable. Marianne's voice, soft and pleading, as if she were standing just behind him. He spun around, his flashlight cutting through the fog, but there was nothing, only the endless gray mist. His heart pounded, his breath shallow, as he called out her name, his voice swallowed by the silence. The whispers returned, now layered with other voices, unfamiliar and ancient, speaking in a tongue that twisted like smoke. They wove around Marianne's voice, distorting it, pulling it deeper into their chorus. "Come to us, see what we see." Elias stumbled forward, drawn toward the mound's summit, his boots sinking into the damp earth. At the top, where the team had begun their excavation, the air felt denser, as if pressing against his skin. He knelt, his fingers brushing the soil where the tablet had been unearthed, and the whispers surged, a cacophony that filled his skull. Images flashed in his mind, vivid, jarring scenes of Marianne, her face pale and bruised, her eyes wide with fear, standing in this very spot. But the visions shifted, blending with older, bloodier images, settlers wielding axes, native warriors falling, their screams echoing across centuries. Elias clutched his head, trying to anchor himself, but the line between memory and hallucination blurred. Was this his grief, or something the mound was forcing him to see? The fog seemed to take shape around him, forming fleeting figures, shadows with hollow eyes, their forms dissolving when he tried to focus. Marianne's voice called again, closer now, from the center of the mound. "Elias, help me!" Against all reason, he began to dig with his bare hands, the cold earth yielding under his fingers. The whispers urged him on, their tones shifting from pleading to commanding. Uncover, release. He found nothing but dirt and roots, yet the act felt necessary, as if he were reaching for her, for answers. The ground pulsed beneath him, a heartbeat that matched his own, and for a moment he saw her, Marianne, standing in the fog, her silhouette flickering like a dying flame. She reached out, her lips moving, but before he could hear her, the vision shattered, and he was alone again, his hands caked with soil. A shout broke the spell, Clara's voice, calling from the camp. Elias staggered back, disoriented, the whispers fading to a low hum. He stumbled down the mound, his flashlight trembling in his grip, and found Clara waiting, her face pale with worry. "What were you doing up there?" she asked, her voice sharp. Elias couldn't answer, his throat tight, his mind still reeling from the visions. The mound stood silent behind him, but its presence lingered, a weight that clung to his soul. As he returned to the camp, the whispers followed, faint but unrelenting, promising answers, and horrors, if he dared to listen again. In the heart of Eldridge Hollow, the Miller family lived in a modest 2-story house, its white paint chipped but proud, a remnant of better days. John Miller, a carpenter in his late 30s, shared the home with his wife, Laura, and their teenage daughter, Emily. They were an ordinary family, known for their quiet kindness and Sunday dinners that filled the air with the scent of roasted chicken. But since the archaeologists began their work at the Whispering Mound, an unseen tension had crept into their lives, like a shadow lengthening at dusk. John had been restless, plagued by nightmares he wouldn't discuss. Laura noticed his hands trembling over his tools, and Emily, usually talkative, had grown withdrawn, her eyes darting to corners of rooms as if expecting to see something there. It began subtly, on the evening after Elias's unsettling night at the mound. Laura was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for stew, when she heard a low hum, like a voice muffled by walls. She paused, knife hovering, and glanced at the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. The hum grew into whispers, not unlike those that had tormented Mrs. Harrow, but these were sharper, laced with accusation. "You bear their shame, you carry their blood." Laura shook her head, blaming fatigue, but the whispers persisted, weaving through her thoughts, stirring memories of her grandmother's tales about the town's founders, tales of betrayal and bloodshed she had dismissed as folklore. Upstairs, Emily sat on her bed, earbuds in, trying to drown out the unease that had settled in her chest. The music did little to help. Beneath it, she heard faint voices, not from her phone but from the air itself. They spoke her name, soft and coaxing, urging her to look under her bed. She resisted at first, but the compulsion grew, a pressure in her mind that felt like a hand guiding her. She slid to the floor, her fingers brushing the dusty space beneath, and found an old wooden box, its surface carved with symbols that mirrored those Elias had uncovered at the mound. Inside were yellowed letters, penned by an ancestor named Abigail Miller, the same woman whose desperate words Elias had read in the library. The whispers grew louder as Emily read, recounting sins of the past, urging her to make it right. John, meanwhile, was in the garage, sanding a table he had been working on for weeks. The repetitive motion usually calmed him, but tonight, his hands moved with a strange urgency, guided by whispers that seemed to rise from the wood itself. They spoke of his lineage, of the Millers who had spilled blood to claim the land, their guilt now his to bear. His vision blurred, and for a moment he saw not wood but flesh beneath his sandpaper, blood welling up in streaks. He dropped the tool, staggering back, but the whispers pressed on, commanding him to carve the symbols from the mound into the table. He obeyed, his hands moving as if possessed, etching swirling patterns that glowed faintly in the dim light. By midnight, the family's ordinary routine had unraveled. Laura, driven by the voices, began arranging kitchen knives in a circle on the dining table, her movements trance-like, as if performing a ritual she didn't understand. Emily joined her, clutching Abigail's letters, her voice reciting words in a language neither knew, her eyes glassy and distant. John emerged from the garage, his hands bloody from splinters, carrying the table now covered in carvings. The family stood together in the dining room, the air thick with fog that had somehow seeped inside, the whispers now a chorus, urging them to complete the ritual. They moved as one, their hands linked, their voices chanting in unison, the symbols on the table pulsing with an unnatural light. The neighbors noticed the lights in the Miller house burning late, the windows glowing through the fog. A passerby, drawn by muffled chants, peered through the dining room window and froze. The family stood in a circle, their faces blank, their hands stained with dirt and blood, the table at the center radiating in eerie glow. The passerby fled, heart pounding, unaware that the mound's curse was spreading, its tendrils reaching deeper into the town. Back at the camp, Elias lay awake, the whispers from the mound echoing in his dreams, carrying fragments of the Millers' names, a warning of the fracture that was only beginning to spread. The morning light in Eldridge Hollow was weak, filtered through a fog that seemed to cling to the town like a second skin. Dr. Elias Thorne sat in his tent at the dig site, the air heavy with the scent of damp canvas and coffee gone cold. The whispers from the mound had haunted his dreams, blending with fragments of Marianne's voice, leaving him hollowed out and raw. The revelations from the library, Ezekiel Harrow's journal, the curse ritual, and the mention of his own family's name had ignited a fire in him, a need to uncover the truth no matter the cost. He couldn't shake the feeling that the mound was pulling him deeper, weaving his past into its dark history. Today, he resolved to return to the library, driven by a compulsion he could no longer ignore. Back in the dusty basement of the town library, Elias pored over more records, his flashlight flickering as the bulb struggled against the oppressive gloom. Mr. Grayson, the librarian, had left him alone, his parting glance heavy with unspoken warning. Elias's fingers trembled as he opened a crumbling ledger marked with the Thorne family name, dated 1784. The pages detailed the life of Caleb Thorne, his great-great-grandfather several times over, a settler who had been a leader in the massacre that stained the Whispering Mound. Caleb's account was cold, clinical, describing the slaughter of the native tribe as a necessary act to secure the land. But beneath the words, Elias sensed fear, a confession of nightmares, of voices that plagued Caleb's sleep, accusing him of betrayal. A second document, a personal letter from Caleb to his wife, revealed more. He wrote of guilt that gnawed at him, of visions that showed the faces of the fallen, their eyes hollow and accusing. The letter mentioned a ritual gone wrong, an attempt by the settlers to appease the spirits by burying their own blood in the mound, a sacrifice that only strengthened the curse. Elias's heart pounded as he read his own surname again and again, each mention tying his bloodline to the mound's wrath. He found a final note, scrawled in Caleb's shaking hand. "The mound remembers. It will take us all." The words sent a chill through him, and for a moment, the basement seemed to close in, the shadows pulsing like a heartbeat. Then came the visions. As Elias closed the ledger, the air grew thick, and the whispers returned, no longer distant but inside his skull. They spoke Marianne's name, weaving it with Caleb's, as if the past and present were collapsing into one. Images flooded his mind, Marianne on the night she died, her body crumpled at the base of their staircase, her neck bruised in ways the coroner couldn't explain. But now the vision shifted. She stood on the mound, her eyes black and empty, her voice accusing him. "You let me die. You bear their sin." Elias staggered back, knocking over a stack of books, his breath ragged. The visions grew bloodier, showing Caleb wielding a blade against screaming figures, their blood soaking the earth. Then Marianne again, her face morphing into one of the fallen, her hands reaching for him. He stumbled out of the basement, the library silent save for the echo of his own footsteps. Outside, the fog had thickened, and the town seemed to watch him, its houses leaning inward like conspirators. Elias clutched the photocopied documents, his mind reeling. His family's role in the massacre wasn't just history. It was a chain binding him to the mound's curse. The visions of Marianne felt like a warning, or perhaps a lure, drawing him back to the dig site. He knew he should stop, should warn the team, but the mound's pull was stronger, its whispers promising answers if he dared to face them. As he walked back to the camp, the air seemed to hum with the names of the fallen, and somewhere in the fog, Marianne's voice lingered, calling him to the mound. The fog over Eldridge Hollow had become a living thing, thick and suffocating, as if the whispering mound itself exhaled it to choke the town. By the third day of the excavation, the air buzzed with an unnatural tension, and Dr. Elias Thorne felt it in his bones as he returned to the camp, the weight of his family's blood-soaked history pressing against his chest. The whispers had spread beyond the mound, seeping into the streets, the homes, the minds of the townsfolk. What had begun with Mrs. Harrow and the Millers was no longer isolated. Eldridge Hollow was unraveling, its people caught in a fever of fear and compulsion that no one could explain. In the town square, where a weathered statue of a settler stood, a crowd had gathered, their voices sharp with panic. Mr. Grayson, the librarian, stood on a bench, his spectacles glinting as he shouted about the mound, calling it a curse awakened by outsiders. His hands shook, clutching a worn Bible, but his words were laced with the same strange cadence Elias had heard in the whispers, as if something else spoke through him. A woman named Margaret, who ran the general store, wept openly, claiming she saw her dead son in her dreams, urging her to dig at the mound. Others nodded, their faces pale, confessing to similar visions, loved ones long gone, accusing them of sins they didn't understand. The possession spread like wildfire. At the diner, a man named Tom, known for his quiet demeanor, smashed plates in a frenzy, carving symbols into the counter with a butter knife, his eyes glassy and distant. Across the street, a young couple barricaded themselves in their home, chanting in a tongue no one recognized, their windows smeared with dirt as if they'd clawed at the earth. Children stopped playing, standing in eerie silence, their gazes fixed on the mound's silhouette in the distance. The town's pastor, Father Daniel, tried to calm the chaos, but even he faltered, his sermons turning to rants about atonement for ancient wrongs, his voice cracking with fear. Elias watched from the edge of the square, his team beside him, their faces etched with dread. Clara whispered that they should leave, that the dig had gone too far, but Elias couldn't tear his eyes from the crowd. He saw the scarred man from the motel bar, the one who had stared at him that first night, now leading a group toward the mound, shovels in hand, their movements jerky, like puppets on strings. The whispers were no longer subtle. They filled the air, a chorus of voices weaving through the fog, urging the townsfolk to act, to unearth, to confess. Elias felt them too, tugging at his mind, Marianne's voice among them, accusing, pleading, pulling him toward the mound. By nightfall, the chaos escalated. Fires burned in backyards, lit by residents who claimed the flames would cleanse the curse. A group of teenagers, Emily Miller among them, gathered at the mound, digging with bare hands, their chants echoing through the valley. The air pulsed with a low hum, and the ground seemed to tremble, as if the mound itself were stirring. Elias and his team tried to intervene, but the townsfolk turned on them, their eyes wild, accusing the archaeologists of awakening the horror. Sophie, usually silent, screamed as a woman lunged at her, clawing at her face, muttering about blood debts. Raj pulled Sophie back, his own hands shaking, while Clara shouted for reason, her voice lost in the din. Elias stood frozen, the documents about his ancestor Caleb burning in his pocket. The town's madness mirrored the visions he'd seen, Marianne's death, the massacre, the curse binding them all. He realized the mound wasn't just a prison for spirits. It was a mirror, reflecting the sins of the past onto the present, twisting guilt into violence. As the crowd surged toward the mound, Elias knew the breaking point was near. The whispers promised release, but at a cost he couldn't yet fathom, and the town was tearing itself apart to pay it. The night in Eldridge Hollow was a void, the fog so dense it seemed to swallow the stars. Dr. Elias Thorne stood at the summit of the whispering mound, his heart pounding as the ground pulsed beneath him, a heartbeat that echoed the chaos consuming the town. The documents about his ancestor Caleb, the visions of Marianne, and the madness gripping the townsfolk had led him here, to a desperate act he barely understood. In the library, he had found a tattered page tucked inside Caleb's journal, describing a sealing ritual, a ceremony to bind the spirits back into the mound, requiring the blood of a descendant and a confession of their sins. Elias, his lineage entwined with the curse, knew he had no choice. The team, shaken by the town's unraveling, had refused to join him, leaving him alone with only a flashlight, a knife, and the weight of centuries. The air was thick with whispers, no longer a chorus but a single, commanding voice, ancient and cold, speaking in a tongue that clawed at his mind. Elias knelt at the center of the mound, where the stone tablet had been unearthed, and began the ritual, his hands trembling as he traced the carved symbols in the dirt. He pricked his finger with the knife, letting drops of blood fall onto the soil, each one sizzling as if the earth were alive. The whispers grew louder, forming words he could almost understand. Confess, atone. He spoke aloud, his voice unsteady, confessing Caleb's sins, the massacre, the greed, the blood spilled to claim the land. But the words felt hollow, as if the mound demanded more, something deeper, something personal. The fog thickened, swirling into a vortex around him, and the lead wraith emerged, a towering, formless shadow with eyes like burning coals, its presence a weight that pressed against his soul. It spoke without a mouth, its voice a blend of Marianne's and the fallen natives, accusing him of carrying the same guilt as his ancestor. You let her die, you cannot escape. Elias's vision blurred, and the mound seemed to open beneath him, a yawning abyss of memories and pain. He saw Marianne's final moments, her fall down the stairs, but now the vision twisted. She was pushed, not by accident but by a force tied to the mound, a force he had unknowingly unleashed by coming here. Elias fought to stay grounded, clutching the knife, chanting the ritual's words from the journal. The wraith pressed closer, its form shifting to mirror Marianne's face, then Caleb's, then countless others, each accusing him, their voices a cacophony that threatened to shatter his mind. He confessed again, this time his own guilt, his failure to save Marianne, his obsession with the mound that had blinded him to the danger. The ground trembled, the symbols glowing faintly, and the wraith recoiled, but only slightly, as if testing his resolve. Elias slashed his palm, letting more blood spill, and shouted the final words of the ritual, his voice raw with desperation. The abyss widened, pulling him into a hallucinatory battle. He saw himself standing in the massacre, wielding Caleb's blade, then as Marianne, falling, her screams merging with those of the fallen natives. The wraith loomed, its eyes boring into him, demanding his soul to seal the curse. Elias resisted, his will fraying, but he clung to the ritual, pouring his grief, his guilt, his everything into the words. The mound shook violently, the fog parting for a moment, and the wraith let out a soundless scream, its form fracturing. Elias collapsed, his blood soaking the earth, the whispers fading to a low hum. He didn't know if he had succeeded, but the air felt lighter, the mound quieter, as if the curse had paused, waiting for its next move. Dawn crept over Eldridge Hollow, a pale, hesitant light that did little to dispel the fog clinging to the valley. Dr. Elias Thorne lay sprawled at the summit of the whispering mound, his body aching, his palm crusted with dried blood from the ritual. The air was still, the oppressive hum of the mound reduced to a faint murmur, as if the earth itself were catching its breath. The sealing ritual had worked, or so it seemed. The wraith had fractured, the whispers had quieted, and the chaos in the town had stilled. Elias staggered to his feet, his flashlight flickering, its beam catching the faint glow of the symbols he had traced in the dirt, now dull and lifeless. He stumbled down the mound, his mind heavy with exhaustion and doubt, unsure if he had truly bound the spirits, or merely delayed their wrath. In Eldridge Hollow, the townsfolk emerged from their homes, their faces drawn and confused, as if waking from a collective nightmare. The fires in the backyards had burned out, leaving charred patches in the grass. The Miller family stood in their yard, Laura clutching Emily, John staring blankly at the carved table they had dragged outside. Mrs. Harrow sat on her porch, her hands still caked with dirt, her eyes vacant but no longer wild. The crowd that had surged toward the mound the previous night dispersed, their shovels abandoned, their chants silenced. Yet the town felt different, marked by an unspoken weight, as if the curse had retreated but not vanished. Elias met his team at the camp, their faces pale with relief but shadowed by fear. Clara whispered that they should leave, and this time, Elias nodded, his resolve broken. As the team packed their gear, Elias returned to the library one last time, drawn to confirm the ritual's success. In the basement, he found Mr. Grayson sorting papers, his hands steady but his eyes avoiding Elias's. Among the archives, Elias discovered a final document, a letter from 1791, written by a native elder who survived the massacre. It described the curse as eternal, a force that could be bound but never destroyed, tied to the blood of the guilty. The elder warned that any attempt to seal it would demand a piece of the confessor's soul, leaving them forever marked. Elias's breath caught, his hand instinctively touching his chest, where a faint ache had lingered since the ritual. He understood now. The mound had taken something from him, something he couldn't name but felt in the hollowness of his heart. Back at the mound for one last look, Elias stood alone, the fog thinner but still present, curling around his ankles. The whispers were gone, but in their place was a new sensation, a quiet pulse, like a heartbeat in his mind, syncing with his own. He saw no visions, heard no voices, but when he closed his eyes, he felt Marianne's presence, not accusing but watching, as if she were now part of the mound's silent vigil. The shocking truth hit him. The ritual hadn't freed him from the curse but bound him to it, his blood and guilt anchoring the spirit's prison. He was no longer just Elias Thorne, archaeologist. He was a keeper of the mound's secrets, doomed to carry its weight forever. The team left Eldridge Hollow that day, their van disappearing into the mist. The town resumed its quiet existence, but the mound remained, its silhouette unchanged, a scar on the landscape. Elias drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the road, but his mind lingered on the mound. Months later, in a new city, he would wake at night, the faint hum of the mound still in his ears, Marianne's face flickering in his dreams. The curse was unsilenced, its echoes woven into his soul, a reminder that some sins never fade, only sleep, waiting for the next to disturb them.